The National Electrical Code, specifically Section 230.2, addresses the use of multiple services. 2 or more services are permitted to supply a single building or other structure, or a single occupancy within one building. However, the code states that a single occupancy shall not be supplied by more than one service from a single utility. This means that generally, a commercial suite should not have 2 separate panel boards fed from 2 separate service meters if those meters are supplied by the same utility. There is an exception to this rule. This exception applies to occupancies requiring redundant service for reliability. In such cases, the loss of any one service would be hazardous to persons or property. For example, a hospital or a data center might require redundant services. If the suite in question does not meet this criteria for redundant service, it is generally not permissible to have 2 separate services from the same utility. The reasoning behind this rule is to prevent creating complex and potentially dangerous electrical systems within a single occupancy. Multiple services can complicate coordination of overcurrent protection, increase the risk of unintentional energization of equipment during maintenance, and make it more difficult for emergency responders to de-energize the entire suite in case of a fire or other hazardous event. Let's delve into a more detailed explanation of the relevant code sections to understand the nuances of this regulation. Firstly, Section 230.2, titled Number of Services, is the primary section addressing the allowance of multiple services. The general rule outlined in this section states that a building or structure shall be supplied by only one service. However, it immediately provides exceptions, paving the way for the allowance of multiple services under specific conditions. Secondly, the exception regarding single occupancies within a building is particularly relevant. It clarifies that while multiple services are permitted for a single building, a single occupancy within that building cannot be supplied by more than one service from a single utility. This implies that if the strip mall has multiple tenants, each tenant can generally have their own service, but a single tenant cannot have multiple services from the same utility unless they meet the criteria for the exception. Thirdly, the exception for redundant service highlights situations where the reliability of the electrical supply is critical. This exception specifically allows multiple services when the loss of one service would create a hazard to people or property. This typically applies to facilities where a continuous and uninterrupted power supply is essential, such as hospitals, data centers, or emergency response centers. In these facilities, redundant services provide a backup power source, ensuring that critical systems continue to operate even if one service fails. Now let's consider the practical implications of this rule. Imagine a commercial strip mall with several retail stores. Each store would typically have its own electrical service, with its own meter and panel board. This arrangement is perfectly acceptable under the NEC, as each store is a separate occupancy and is being supplied by a single service. However, if one of the stores wanted to expand and take over the space next door, creating a single, larger occupancy, they would generally not be allowed to maintain 2 separate services from the same utility. Instead, they would need to consolidate their electrical systems into a single service, fed from a single meter and panel board. The only exception would be if they could demonstrate that the loss of one service would create a hazardous condition. This might be the case if the store operated a critical business, such as a pharmacy that needed to maintain a constant temperature for medications, or a data center that needed to keep its service running at all times. In such cases, the store could apply for permission to have redundant services, but they would need to provide documentation to support their claim that the loss of power would create a hazard. It is also important to understand the role of the local authority having jurisdiction, or OJ. The AHA is the entity responsible for enforcing the NEC and other electrical codes in a particular area. The AHA has the final say in whether or not a particular installation is compliant with the code. If a business wants to install multiple services, they should consult with the AHA to get their approval. The AHA may require additional documentation or inspections to ensure that the installation is safe and compliant. Furthermore, the NEC provides additional requirements for service equipment, including disconnects, overcurrent protection, and grounding. These requirements are designed to ensure that the electrical system is safe and reliable. When multiple services are installed, it is especially important to carefully coordinate the overcurrent protection to prevent cascading failures. Each service should have its own main disconnect, which can be used to de-energize the entire service in case of an emergency. The grounding system must also be properly designed to ensure that all metallic parts of the electrical system are properly grounded, which helps to prevent electric shock hazards. In summary, while the NEC allows for multiple services under certain conditions, it generally prohibits a single occupancy from being supplied by more than one service from a single utility. The exception to this rule is when redundant services are required for reliability and the loss of one service would create a hazard. If you are considering installing multiple services, it is important to consult with a qualified electrician and the local AHA to ensure that the installation is compliant with all applicable codes and regulations. It is also crucial to understand the difference between a service and a feeder. A service is the electrical supply from the utility company to the building or structure. A feeder is the electrical supply from the service equipment to a panel board or other distribution point within the building. While a single occupancy cannot generally have multiple services from the same utility, it can have multiple feeders fed from a single service. This is a common arrangement in large buildings with multiple panel boards. Each panel board is fed by a separate feeder, which allows for better distribution of power and more flexibility in circuit design. However, all of the feeders must originate from the same service equipment. Let's consider some real-world examples to illustrate these concepts. Firstly, a large office building might have a single service entrance with multiple feeders distributing power to different floors or departments. Each floor or department would have its own panel board fed by a separate feeder. This allows for better control over the electrical system and makes it easier to isolate problems in one area without affecting the entire building. Secondly, a manufacturing plant might have a single service entrance with multiple feeders distributing power to different machines or processes. Each machine or process would have its own panel board fed by a separate feeder. This allows for better protection of the equipment and makes it easier to shut down individual machines or processes for maintenance without affecting the entire plant. Thirdly, a hospital might have multiple services for redundancy, with each service feeding a different set of critical systems. For example, one service might feed the emergency power system, while another service feeds the normal power system. This ensures that the hospital can continue to operate even if one service fails. In conclusion, understanding the NEC requirements for multiple services is crucial for ensuring the safety and reliability of electrical systems in commercial buildings. While multiple services are allowed under certain conditions, it is important to carefully consider the code requirements and consult with qualified professionals to ensure compliance. Remember, safety should always be the top priority when working with electricity. When dealing with commercial spaces in a strip mall setting and evaluating the allowance of separate panel boards fed from separate service meters connected to a multimeter service bus or MSB, there are critical factors rooted in the NEC regulations to consider. Firstly, it's crucial to verify the specific requirements outlined in NEC section 230.2 concerning the number of services allowed for a building or occupancy. This section generally restricts a single occupancy from having multiple services from the same utility unless specific conditions, like redundancy for critical operations, are met. Secondly, it's necessary to assess whether the commercial suite qualifies for an exception that permits multiple services due to the need for redundancy or other special circumstances. The suite's operations might necessitate an uninterrupted power supply, and the absence of such a supply could pose significant risks to people or property, therefore it would justify the allowance of multiple services. Thirdly, it's important to examine the local regulations and requirements set forth by the local authority having jurisdiction, or UDGE, as they may have additional rules or interpretations regarding the installation and use of multiple services in commercial buildings. Compliance with these local guidelines is essential. Fourthly, coordinating with the utility company is necessary to confirm their policies and requirements concerning multiple meters and services for a single commercial space. The utility's perspective and requirements play a key role in determining the feasibility and permissibility of the proposed electrical setup. Fifthly, the design of the electrical system must adhere to safety standards and best practices. This includes proper overcurrent protection, grounding, and disconnect mechanisms to ensure the safety of occupants and electrical workers and to prevent potential hazards. Sixthly, compliance with all applicable codes and regulations, including the NEC, local building codes, and any other relevant standards, is critical for ensuring the safety and legality of the electrical installation. This compliance is an ongoing requirement for operating legally and safely. Seventhly, documentation of the electrical system design, including detailed plans, calculations, and specifications, should be maintained for future reference and for use during inspections. Complete and accurate documentation is necessary for demonstrating compliance and for facilitating maintenance and repairs. In addition to these considerations, the cost implications of installing and maintaining multiple services should be carefully evaluated. Multiple services can lead to higher installation costs, increased utility bills, and added maintenance expenses. Analyzing the long-term financial impact is critical for making informed decisions about the electrical system. Furthermore, the flexibility and scalability of the electrical system should be taken into account. Evaluating whether the proposed electrical setup can accommodate future growth or changes in the commercial suite's operations is important. This ensures that the electrical system can adapt to evolving needs without requiring major modifications. In conclusion, determining whether the NEC allows a commercial suite to have two separate panelboards fed from two separate service meters within a multi-meter service bus requires a thorough assessment of NEC regulations, local requirements, utility policies, safety standards, and cost implications. Consulting with qualified electrical engineers and contractors is recommended to ensure compliance and safety.